Delighted to be joined now by Sir Andrew Wood, former British ambassador to Russia from 1995 to 2000. You've said I can call you Andrew, so we'll drop the sir and be familiar, Andrew. Lovely to speak to you this morning. Now, Alexei Navalny's family have reacted to his death by saying it's orchestrated murder. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, and it's not the first time, and it won't be the last.
I know when you were in office, you met Putin a couple of times. Tell us what he's actually like.
Well, at the time, he was. We were talking about the possibility of his meeting with Tony Blair, and more immediately, the way that the war in Chechnya was then going, which is an extremely brutal war on the part of the Russians, but it was also one which attracted support for him as a future president. I didn't myself get a judgment as to whether he's a good man or a bad man, but we would see.
Yes, the jury was out at that point, but now 25 years on, from having first met him as Prime Minister to now, I mean, what's your assessment of where he is at? In the sense, not only in the context of Ukraine, but obviously now the sudden death of Navalny. You could say that that was inevitably always going to happen. However, it does sort of move the dial really on, I suppose, the degree to which he isn't willing to stop.
He is not willing to stop. And in my eyes, he's defined himself as essentially a traitor to Russian interests. Russia itself and the Russian people aren't habitual killers and persuaded that the whole purpose of their life is to offend and attack others. But the fact is that he himself is stimulated by fear as being the right policy to introduce to other people. And he also himself, I think, suffers from fear because he's locked himself into a particularly vicious set of policies, and rather futile ones too.
I mean, you obviously got to know the Russian population very, very well in your time there. We've heard from Navalny's widow, Yulia, saying that she wants to continue his work. We've obviously seen protesters come out in support of Navalny on the streets of Moscow. There's been hundreds of arrests. What likelihood is there of there being an uprising among the Russian people in response to this death?
In direct response to his death, I do not think there is going to be such a reaction. It does touch on the proper feelings of large numbers of Russians, but at the same time, as I said earlier, this is not the first person he's killed. My very good friend Nemtsov was killed outside the Kremlin, and so on and so forth. They know that this is the way he acts, and they also are stuck with the immediate difficulty of how to react in the context of the war against Ukraine. Plus the fact is that there's no one else to replace him.
Are you worried about the prospect of a second Trump presidency in light of his relationship with Russia?
Well, I'm not a fan of his, so the answer is yes. But he's a changeable sort of person, and he has also, in his previous presidency, done some quite brave things and good things in the context that he was in. So I think you can't tell.
And when the Foreign Secretary David Cameron talks about consequences for Russia, look, we know that there have been sanctions, we know that Russian assets have been seized. Does it actually make any difference to Putin? I mean, what consequences can there possibly be for the Russian president in your mind?
I don't think direct consequences, but the fact that he's losing a grip on public opinion in other countries abroad is important. The fact that he is doing his best to hide what has happened to Navalny and the way it has happened in Russia itself is indicative. He's trying to put it as something which happened, wasn't his fault, because nothing ever is. And he will hope it simply disappears in terms of the Russian electorate. And that might be right. He's bound to win when it comes to later this year, in March, because the system is so constructed.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, the timing of Navalny's death and, as you say, these forthcoming elections, which I think we can suggest now fairly plainly aren't going to be free and fair. Another question for you as a former ambassador, Andrew. I mean, where do you think, when it comes to looking at the Western world, the biggest threat is coming from? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it Iran? What's your assessment of the state of things at the moment?
Well, the immediate trigger is more likely, I think, to be Iran or the general chaos that's going on there, because we've got rather used to what's going on in Ukraine. I think we are being a little bit too gloomy about it because we concentrate on physical borders in Ukraine. We haven't looked sufficiently, for example, at the enormous success Ukraine has had in dealing with the Russian Navy. And that will be a long war, and a very threatening one for all of us.
Indeed so. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning, Sir Andrew Wood, former ambassador to Russia from 1995 to 2000.